This act flows from a clear and simple wrong. Its only purpose is to right that wrong. This law will ensure them the right to vote. The wrong is one which no American in his heart can justify. The right is one which no American, true to our principles, can deny.
That was President Lyndon B. Johnson 56 years ago today, speaking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The bill made it illegal to impose restrictions on federal, state, and local elections designed to deny African Americans the right to vote. Presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin and Eugene Robinson are still with us, and joining the conversation, the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation, Mark Updegrove, and founder and CEO of All In Together, Lauren Leader. Good morning to you both. Welcome. Doris, I want to start with you on this as you watched President Johnson deliver that speech on August 6, 1965, and you consider the pressure he was under from a lot of people not to support and to push through the Voting Rights Act, that he was going to lose some of his base, he was going to lose the Southern vote, and he said famously, "What the hell is the presidency for?"
Oh, how I remember that day, actually. I was 22 years old. If I could have ever imagined after Bloody Sunday, when I was listening to President Johnson give the joint session of Congress speech that led to the passage of that voting rights, that a few years later I'd be working for President Johnson, and 10 years later would marry the man, Richard Goodwin, who had helped to craft those words. It was an extraordinary time. It was a triumph greater, as Johnson said, than any battlefield victory. The basic right to vote, he said, is the most fundamental of all rights, without which all the rest are meaningless. It's simply wrong to deny your fellow Americans the right to vote. How we need that clarity right now, the fight that is being fought right now to strike down voter rights, to bring back suppression, to undo what happened in 1965 is the fundamental fight of our time right now. I mean, it's not a partisan fight. In a democracy, this is the most important thing, to allow individuals. Otherwise, what's the point of a democracy if individuals can't vote? And the more of them can vote freely, fairly, the more better that democracy will be. So remembering this day, it's a very emotional thing for me because it meant so much, but it should be an emotional memory for all the country to go back to that fight that we fought back then.
And Mark, how appropriate that we have Doris here today. As you pointed out in the break, her husband wrote the words that we just heard there from President Johnson. Can you speak to the pressure that I mentioned that he was under at the time and how difficult a leap this was for him? It seems obvious as we sit here in 2021, but what were the conditions around that push to get the Voting Rights Act passed?
Willie, he had put all of his political capital into passing the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And there was a very potent plank in the Civil Rights Act around voting rights. And he stripped it out because he knew that the bill was top-heavy and it simply wouldn't pass through Congress. So he looked at civil rights incrementally. Let's break the back of Jim Crow first, and then we'll move on to voting rights when we have the opportunity to do so. But in the meantime, he looked for every means necessary to ensure that voting rights were enforced. Then Bloody Sunday happened, that brutally thwarted civil rights and voting rights march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, led by, very famously, by John Lewis. And then LBJ realized he had the moral authority to push something through. And he seized that moment and gave that magnificent speech written by Doris's late husband. And that he appealed to the country to say, you need to this is not right. This is fundamentally un-American. And eventually, he saw to the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
So, Mark, let me stay with you for a second here. We're seeing, of course, right now, an assault, Democrats say, on voting rights across the country. And states, Republican state legislatures are restricting access to the ballot. And there's been a lot of pressure on Joe Biden to defend voting rights in a similar position, perhaps, as LBJ. He gave a powerful speech in Philadelphia a few weeks about it. Biden, like Johnson, creatures of the Senate. They know how the body works. And there's a lot right now on people want Biden to come out against the filibuster, to eliminate it or modify it. How do you think President Johnson would have handled a situation like this?
I think he would have run over anybody who got in the way. But he was also an institutionalist. He was also a traditionalist. He was a creature, as you pointed out, Jonathan, of the Senate. Biden was in the Senate far longer than LBJ, 36 years, longer than any president we've ever had. He understands its traditions. And I think he's very resistant to break them down. By the same token, what we don't know right now is what's happening behind the scenes. One of the crown jewels of the LBJ Presidential Library archive are the tape telephone conversations of LBJ doing the business of his presidency. And you can hear in those tapes what he's doing behind the scenes, getting people to bend to his will. Joe Biden may well be doing that now, and we might not know it for years and years. So that's because he has those relationships, because he understands politics and the way things work, that may be happening as we speak.
Lauren, you and Mark have an op-ed in The Hill titled Lessons for Biden on the 56th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. In it, you write this: like President Lyndon Baines Johnson, Biden is a creature of the Senate, one who understands and appreciates the upper chamber's traditions and nuances. If anyone can effectively get a controversial bill through a polarized Senate as Johnson did, it's Joe Biden. But what 2021 and 1965 have in common is the threat against the stability and durability of democracy itself. The lesson of LBJ is not that he had absolute power, that he wielded absolutely to accomplish exceptionally hard aims. Instead, LBJ had the courage and conviction to lever every bit of soft power at his disposal, from personally pressuring lawmakers to enlisting the grassroots across the nation to bring his cause to the fore. LBJ knew he would alienate many of the southern states, but he did it anyway. It was that important. So obviously very different times, very different political circumstances, different media circumstances, and different polarization right now. But what do you see as the stakes right now as we look at voting rights and for this president?
Well, clearly, the enfranchisement of voters, thanks to the Voting Rights Act, has had a transformational effect on American democracy at every level. The participation of women, the participation of African Americans, the participation of minorities of every background has had a profound impact on what our government looks like today, how we function as a society. And so any efforts that roll those back that would keep people from the polls is devastating for all Americans, obviously. It's especially devastating potentially for the Democratic Party going into the midterms. And I think that's part of why these stakes are so high. If he doesn't get something done on voting rights now, he risks the majority in the Senate, the majority in the House. We risk the future of the country for years to come. And it's not just about a political aim. It really is about making sure that every voter is heard. You know, one thing I find so interesting about this was that grassroots engagement in Johnson's time, his incredibly close relationship with Martin Luther King and his ability to sort of mobilize a sense of moral outrage in the country. I haven't really seen Biden do that. He has not really appealed in the same way, I think, to that very personal sense of you're about to lose a right that is sacred. And I think that's going to be critical. We're going to need a massive push from the grassroots, pressuring Congress, pressuring the Senate relentlessly if we're going to get anything passed.
So what can he reasonably be expected to do when you have a 50-50 Senate and you have a couple of senators who say, I'm not going along with the big bill, I'm willing to look at the John Lewis bill? What can a president do under these circumstances?
Well, look, obviously the elephant in the room is the filibuster.
Yeah.
I mean, he's said very clearly he's not willing to roll back the filibuster, but it's hard to understand why he wouldn't consider it for voting rights, which has already been floated as a compromise, you know, just on certain key issues that have to do with the sustainability and durability of democracy. We have to get things done. So I hope he'll come around on that. But if not, I think Mark's right. I think there's going to be a lot of back-channel conversations. He's going to let Republicans very quietly lead on this. Certainly people like Manchin and Sinema, who've become so critical to him getting anything done, he's going to have to find a way to give them a win, to let them look like this is their win. And that is one thing I think he's exceptionally good at, is taking his own ego out of it. He doesn't care about the credit, but he just wants to get it done, and I hope he's going to be relentless in the pursuit of that.
So, Jean, Republicans have shown no appetite for any of the voting rights legislation that's up right now. And, as Lauren says, there's some convincing to do with a couple of Democratic senators if they're going to move on it as well.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between now and 1965, I think, is that it's the anti-democratic forces that are seeking to be on the offensive, to roll back the clock, essentially to roll back what was done in 1965, and that force has to be met with greater political force, I think, from the side of democracy and the side of expanding the franchise and including more and more Americans in our democracy, and that's that's not an easy thing to do, but it's not happening adequately now. They've got to get something through the Senate, and it's very difficult to see how that happens now. I hope Mark Updegrove is right that behind the scenes there's arm twisting and cajoling and sweet talking and all of that going on. But I really hope we see the results, because what's being threatened is all that we have gained since 1965, and that's just an enormous threat to American democracy as we know it.
I mean, the White House, Willie, hasn't given up on a legislative solution, but you're seeing their emphasis recently has been shifted to more on the legal front and also to increase voter turnout, believing that they can overcome some of these obstacles if they can just get more people to the polls. And look, they recognize this. This is voting rights. It is perhaps the most sacred right of a democracy. It's also could be a motivator, and you get people out to turn out in 2022 to vote for this, protect your right to the ballot. As of now, they don't have the votes. We'll see if that dynamic changes. Doris Kearns Goodwin, always so great to have you in a conversation like this. Eugene Robinson, Lauren Leader, Mark Updegrove, thank you all as well. Still ahead on Morning